Ladies and gentlemen, a warm online welcome to the Spirits Europe annual trade review event where resilience is the master word. And what does it take to be resilient? Spirit, of course. But should we be high-spirited or low-spirited? Should we be approaching international trade with ambition and optimism, or rather with caution and uncertainty? Well, to find out, we'll be together for the next 2 hours, keeping our spirits high and feeling the pulse of the European spirits sector, and we'll be hearing from leading policy experts on the state of play of EU international trade policy and from industry experts on where they see the trade going. And being online does not necessarily mean that this is a one-way street and a conversation between speakers. And I strongly encourage you to use the Slido tool, which is to the right of your live streaming window, and where you will already see a first poll, that is to feel the pulse of the audience with regard to your expectations from EU trade policy. So can you describe in one word what your main expectation is? You can also join the conversation on Twitter by following the Spirits Europe account and using the hashtag #SpiritOfResilience. And now, let me hand over to Ulrich Adam, who is Director General at Spirits Europe, for his opening words.
Thank you very much. I'm really pleased to welcome all of you to the 2021 edition of Spirits Europe's Trade Review. Last year and the past months have been a particularly challenging time for all of us, and the spirit sector has been no exception. The COVID crisis had a deep impact on us with the travel restrictions and hospitality closures that came with this. And on top of that, we had EU-US trade disputes and the tariffs that came with them, related tariffs and Brexit. And all of this had a negative impact on our export performance. Against this background, it is clear that we need now trade more than ever. Last year, 2/3 of our sector revenues were generated through exports to third countries. So this clearly is the main route to our sector's recovery. And when we look ahead, the future does look bright, I think, in the sense that 85% of global growth is happening outside the EU. That is a bright perspective for sure. But we need in Europe to link to this positive development, and international trade and the ability to export our products throughout the world will be the critical tool to make sure we can benefit from that development. When companies export, invest abroad, they export high quality standards, creating mutual benefits and paving the way for sustainable recovery. And investing in third countries also means investing in growth and jobs locally, which is particularly important in developing countries, from marketing functions to the added benefits that spirits bring to all the jobs in the hospitality sector. At the same time, spirits are big in creating local growth and jobs in Europe. 2/3 of our exported products are protected by geographical indications. That means the jobs and the production cannot be moved away from the country or the region of origin. And there we clearly have a direct positive impact on growth and jobs in the Union. We already support 1.2 million jobs directly, indirectly, and induced in Europe, and generate more than 45 billion of public finance contributions. Our companies are also committed to reducing their global environmental footprint and are invested in a lot of CSR projects. The best ways for our members to continue to support the recovery, both here in Europe and abroad, is for the EU to maintain an open and ambitious trade policy. In a minute, you will find out more about our export performance in 2020 and how trade policy can support our future recovery. And you will also hear from a panel of distinguished speakers what role the transatlantic relationship can play in addressing the challenges ahead of us, as well as the role that trade can play in the recovery. But first and foremost, it's my great pleasure to welcome Maciej Golubiewski, who is the head of Agriculture Commissioner Wojciechowski, and he's a very busy man, and we congratulate him to the achievement of the CAP reform in the past days, and we're very grateful that he's taken time from his busy calendar to formally open this event. Mr. Golubiewski, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Director General. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you for the invitation. One thing when we talk about resilience in those difficult times that hopefully are becoming the past is to ensure and highlight that our relationships do not falter. And I think we have a good relationship. We've managed to maintain, albeit virtually, our relations online with the Spirits Europe, but also with some of your members. So we're always available if you need us. So that's a declaration from our commissioner, from myself on behalf of our cabinet and our services. So please never waver from approaching us with any questions you might have. Well, spirit drinks are obviously clearly part of our European cultural identity. And I think that's something that all of us know and are proud of. Every EU member state and region, I believe, counts its traditional spirit drinks, and many of which have crossed their local boundaries to become well known all over Europe and the world. As you rightly noticed, we are exporting a lot. Many of these spirit drinks are premium, very high quality agri-food products, very much rooted in their local territories, local economies, societies. We all know and appreciate the French cognac, Irish whiskey, Polish vodka. This is the country where I am from and my commissioner is. Spanish brandy, what have you, Italian grappa, as well as the German, Austrian schnapps, liqueurs, what have you. And there's many more. More than 240 of these local products are protected by the EU law as geographical indications against counterfeiting and notoriety damage in the internal market. This is a good development. We pay particular attention to protecting our GIs and promoting new GIs, and this is a priority for our commissioner. You know his mission letter very well. This is very much something that we will now focus on a bit more squarely after the CAP reform is done. So count on that. Then the EU is also consistently protecting leading spirit drink GIs with our bilateral agreements. So also in the kind of formal context, we're doing so. But from my own perspective, what is particularly important is that all these spirit drinks, be they produced by big or small distillers, are equally important to the European agriculture, for which they constitute an enormous outlet, and for the European economy in general. In fact, not only are our spirit drinks crucial for the image and reputation of Europe across the globe, being it clearly an export-driven sector, as I mentioned before, but they also generate growth and jobs, not least, again, to our farmers. With over 1 million direct and indirect jobs, and Director General mentioned how many jobs you're supporting, I think the figure you mentioned is even higher. The European spirit drink sector is one of the biggest contributors to the agri-food economy in Europe today. More globally, spirit drinks are an essential asset of our economy as a whole, and a showcase of European excellence worldwide. It is thus with great pride that we can say that Europe is the first world producer and exporter of spirit drinks, and we are rightly proud to say so. Though through its hard work and dedication, the spirit drinks industry has become one of the jewels in our crown, and our producers have a well-deserved global reputation for quality and innovation. And that's not going anywhere, notwithstanding the trade crises, the COVID pandemics, what have you. We have amazing craftsmen and producers, and they continue to produce excellent products. Unfortunately, the last couple of years have been extremely challenging for everybody, and in particular for your sector, as you already mentioned. Along with Brexit, which has already reduced considerably the exports and trade balance figures that we were accustomed to acknowledge on an annual basis, the sector had to pay a heavy toll also to the COVID crisis due to the export difficulties, the drastic reduction of the duty-free channel, and the long closure of the hospitality sector virtually everywhere. And no need to mention how hard that sector was hit, and hopefully we're seeing a real revival of it as we speak. We also were well aware of the consequences on your sector's trade of the sanctions imposed between the EU and the US in the framework of the unrelated, but nonetheless affecting the sector, Airbus and Boeing WTO dispute. I really do hope that what we saw during the US-EU summit, this breakthrough declaration that this is behind us, that now we're working to really find a real solution, and we're now suspending those retaliatory tariffs on both sides. I think we're moving into a bright future on that score, and hopefully farmers and relatedly spirits producers will not be collateral damage in those transatlantic trade disputes that have nothing to do with agriculture, nothing to do with your industry. However, we hope that we will soon, as I said, have all this behind us, so then we can now look at ways to recover and reconstruct our businesses. The Commission and the Commissioner is very confident that this reconstruction will take place in line with its new green agenda, and is doing all in its power to ensure this, notably through financing and monitoring of the national recovery and resilience plans that you're, I'm sure, familiar with. The President is now visiting member states, signing those, and I think we are on the way to approving all of them very, very shortly. Of course, it is crucial that the sector maintains its importance as outlet for high-quality agricultural products and as an economic driver. To this purpose, you have now a brand. You have now a brand new spirits drinks regulation, which only became applicable last month, so not too long ago, to ensure that also in the future, only very high-quality spirit drinks are produced and marketed in Europe. We really are going for quality over quantity here. It also guarantees a sound system for the registration and the protection of spirits geographic indicators, and in general provides for a legislative framework that is adapted to the needs of the sector and that continues supporting its substantive growth. Before the COVID crisis, the Commission had launched the Farm to Fork strategy, which is a vision, a political vision to transform the way we produce, distribute, and consume the food that we eat, and to improve our health and environment. This is a holistic vision, and I think all of us can subscribe to it, and it covers the whole kind of chain from farm to fork, as the name suggests. I think we can all agree this transition to the sustainable systems is irreversible and urgent, and we need to face this challenge together. Although I'm sure the spirits drink sector is sustainable by nature and sustained by nature, and that is how it is, the new Commission's agenda is clearly an opportunity for it to contribute to the EU sustainability targets. I know that you're already making all reasonable efforts to support a sustainable EU agri-food sector on all fronts, environmental, economic, and social, as this strengthens and protects the reputation of the industry. I've become familiarized with your projects such as the Farm to Glass initiative, which I think really in a very good way matches our strategic ambitions and objectives of the Farm to Fork strategy. And it is, I believe, a clear testimony of your efforts in this sense. So thank you for that, and congratulations. At the same time, the important health dimension of the strategy must be underlined, and contributions from the sector to encourage responsible consumption of alcoholic beverages are of great importance. I know there have been questions about the Beating Cancer Plan. This is really all trying to raise awareness about responsible consumption in line with the UN sustainable goals. And I think reach out to us. I think some of the concerns that have been voiced, I think we can placate those. I think we can all agree that we're in the same boat here, trying to promote responsible consumption of alcohol. Anyway, we invite you to continue on this path. Report regularly on the progress achieved to us, to the Commission services. So in the end, as you see, the Commission is very well aware of the strength of the sector, but also the challenges and barriers that you face, which will be addressed during this event. And I see the speakers are extremely well placed to go into detail on this. And I will try to listen in a little bit. Well, actually, I'm not sure I can, but I'm sure Chiara will update you once you're done with how it went. But I would like to finish with wishing you a constructive dialogue, a successful conference, and thank you again for this invitation. As I said, our relationship with Spirits Europe is important to us, the Commissioner and the services, and let's ensure that this coming year is much better than what was what it was under the pandemic and under all those attendant circumstances that just threw everything up. And I really hope it will be. It cannot get worse, and I think it's getting better. So good luck, and I hope to see you also personally at some point in the future, in the nearby future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Golubiewski, for this opening address, which sets the scene for our event. You speak of the importance of the spirit sector for the cultural identity of Europe, but also its importance for its socio-economic development. And at the same time that it's extremely exports oriented, which brings us really to the topic of the day on international trade. So thank you very much for having been with us, Mr. Golubiewski. And to continue to go deeper into this international trade policy, we cross over Rue de la Loi and Rue Béliard to the European Parliament to get a perspective from the Vice Chair of the INTA Committee, Anna Michelle Asimakopoulou. She is member of the European Parliament. Can you tell us a little bit about the scene ahead of us for EU international trade policy and where you would like to see it going? Over to you, Anna Michelle.
Thank you so much, and it's such a pleasure to participate in Spirit Europe's Trade Review 2021. Thank you so much also to Pauline and Carol, who gave me the opportunity to provide the foreword for your trade brochure. The EU, as was said by Mr. Golubiewski, is a leading producer of high-quality spirits drinks, which is a reflection of our diverse and rich cultural heritage. I'm going to, of course, mention spirits from Greece, my home country, where we have 15 GIs which are registered for spirits, including Ouzo, Sipuro, which I also produce, and Sikoudia, to name just a few of them. These spirit drinks are a great symbol of European traditions and know-how, which is combined with high production standards and a long-standing commitment to sustainability. Now, international trade plays a vital role for EU businesses and particularly for the spirits industry. There's a huge demand abroad for European spirits, and the sector's ability to export and reach out to consumers around the globe is supported by the European Union's vast network of trade agreements. As you know, we have 46 agreements with 78 different countries. There are still also lots of untapped markets with great potential to improve market access and to remove trade barriers. I'm mentioning agreements like Mercosur, ASEAN, markets in India, markets in China. International trade is truly one of the critical driving forces of development for the European economy. And I think, and I mentioned this when I spoke before, I think too often people perceive trade as something that's abstract rather than what it really is, which is a positive force for prosperity. And I'm interested in joining my voice to others who are championing trade as this kind of a positive force, with politicians and with stakeholders who need to make it a top priority to raise awareness of citizens about the positive effects of international trade. I know we've all heard these statistics before, but they're worth mentioning every time we discuss trade. International trade supports 1 in 7 jobs in the European Union. EU exports to the world support 35 million jobs across the EU, which is up by 20 million since 2000. 60% of European Union imports are actually used to produce European Union goods. And the EU's increased openness to imports since 1995 has boosted its income by about 550 billion euro. In 2019, the European Union exported over 3.1 trillion worth of goods and services and imported 2.8 trillion of goods and services. Taken together, this makes us, as you know, the biggest actor on the world trading scene. And while we have this advantage, and when it comes to spirits, many well-known categories of GIs are primarily consumed abroad. 99% of Swedish vodka, 98% of French cognac are consumed outside of their home country. So this broad global appeal is also shared by Greek spirits, whose overall exports to third countries has grown almost 40% in the last 10 years, even when we take the difficulties that were mentioned and hit the sector throughout COVID-19. The sustained success of spirits exports is helping the sector support jobs and growth across the European Union, including in many rural areas. And this is a critical point. The role of the EU trade policy is primarily to ensure that producers in Europe, small and large, can make the most of new opportunities for the benefit of the broader European economy and its citizens. And we should always keep this in mind. This is how I see international trade. This is how my political family, the European People's Party, sees it as well. Now, earlier this year, and the distinguished panel that follows will be discussing this, the revision of the trade policy made a successful effort to find balance. And as you're aware, now we have open, sustainable, and assertive as the trade policy pillars, which is meant to ensure opportunities and a level playing field for our businesses and address the contemporary challenges that we face, including COVID and recovery from the pandemic, increasing tensions in international trade, and of course, integrating our main priorities, which are the Green Deal and the digital agenda. So the TPR has its three core objectives. One is to increase our open strategic autonomy. Two is to have an economic recovery that's in line with the green and digital transitions. And third, to move forward on our agenda for sustainable globalization. This is a very bold agenda, let's put it that way, but the TPR does address a number of issues and observations that have been raised, particularly by the European People's Party since the start of the pandemic within the Parliament's Committee on International Trade, where I have the honor and the pleasure to serve as vice chair. I'll just go through a few of these points. Firstly, the pandemic has exposed that we have a number of dangerous and disturbing dependencies and vulnerabilities in the EU. There's a sense of urgency that we need to re-engineer or diversify, call it what you will, our supply chains in order to make sure that they become more resilient and to reinforce our trade toolbox to shield us against distorting trade practices internationally. Secondly, we continue to recognize that SMEs are instrumental to our post-COVID recovery, and we're calling for more engagement with SMEs so that they can take better advantage of our trade agreements. In Greece, I've been engaged in an extensive national campaign on showing SMEs the benefits of our trade agreements through the use of the Access to Market platform. Thirdly, the COVID-19 pandemic has massively accelerated digitization, and I think that it's important to strengthen our digital infrastructure and to harmonize the regulatory framework so that we can overcome whatever barriers or bottlenecks exist in the e-commerce sector. And I know that for a number of businesses, including spirits exporters, a very strong e-commerce framework guided by the WTO would open promising avenues and facilitate access to markets everywhere in the world. At the Parliament, we've recently heard that the pace of work at the WTO on e-commerce is picking up, and I think that this is a very good development, and I hope that the ministerial conference will bring even more progress on this front. I'd also like to mention that the EU and its allies need to be more geopolitically intertwined or involved in the world. This means engaging proactively with like-minded countries in the pursuit of an assertive and strategic trade agenda, whether this has to do with WTO reform, with confronting China's unfair trade practices, and violations of human rights. Now, the most interesting recent development in terms of, let's say, international trade and foreign affairs is the EU-US summit. President Biden's choice to make Brussels his first overseas destination, I think demonstrates that the US is, again, ready to constructively engage with the European Union on common geopolitical objectives. And there's been a vast amount of excellent announcements after the summit, including the establishment of the proposed by the EU Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council, a vaccine task force, a climate action group, a green tech alliance, a working group to accelerate progress on major trade disputes. And we did have what I would call a breakthrough on Airbus Boeing, which is a 17-year-long aircraft subsidies dispute where I think we've seen the beginning of an effort to bury the hatchet finally. But of course, this is just a 5-year extension of the recently agreed truce which provides some relief from duties for the companies trading the 11.5 billion of goods and services which were caught in the crossfire of this dispute, including the spirits industry. But it's not quite, let's say, the definitive deal that I had hoped could have been achieved. In addition, there are other critical issues which have been left unresolved: steel and aluminum tariffs, to start with a big one, the reestablishments of a data transfer mechanism across the Atlantic, and of course, restoring the WTO's capabilities, especially with respect to dispute resolution. So don't get me wrong, the EU and the EU-US summit definitely, let's say, marks the beginning of a new chapter of our transatlantic alliance. And it's great to see that we now have some fora for tangible cooperation, but I have to admit that I am becoming a little bit impatient in seeing us overcome our disagreements and instead focus our efforts toward our shared democratic and liberal values and how these transcend the geopolitical playing field at the moment. This means for me and for the EPP supporting multilateralism and strengthening the role of the WTO, creating this global tech alliance with democracies across the world and addressing trade distorting practices regardless of our financial interests. Nevertheless, we are healing. We are healing as a society from COVID. I think we're healing in the EU-US relationship. And I think that it's fair to say that we're entering a more upbeat and conciliatory political paradigm. In the end, if the EU can work with its allies to ensure that we have a fair, predictable, and rules-based multilateral trading system anchored in the WTO, I think that this will benefit consumers across the world. It'll benefit our EU citizens, and I think it'll also benefit the very important European spirits industry. So with these words of introduction, I'd like to thank you again for the honor and the pleasure of being here today, and I look forward to the discussion that follows. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna Michelle, for these words. And I'd like to actually bring in the Slido results to our initial poll, and maybe ask you, Anna Michelle, to comment on that. What I see here is if I bring together a couple of these words, like active, which I will say is proactive, breakthrough agreements, conflict solutions, success. I think there's a desire for EU trade policy to be proactive. And you mentioned some of the great benefits that international trade can bring. You were as a positive force, but it also is a force of disruption. Anna Michelle, what would be your words then to businesses, maybe especially in the spirit sector, who are heavily reliant on exports, in terms of how should they be approaching the future?
Well, let's start positively and say let's approach the future with optimism. How's that? Let's start with that. But I think that the key words for the future are going to be resilience, adaptability, and foresight. And I think that your industry is well placed to champion and, let's say, progress by all three of these. I mean, we've learned a lot, all of us, in these past crises. I think it's at the forefront of our understanding that we need to touch people's lives as much as possible and explain to them how our activities are doing that. And I think we need to plan for the future. So these would be my, let's say, guarded words of wisdom.
Okay, and maybe then one more word also on the role then of the European Parliament and how you see your specific role in all of this. I mean, there are obviously member states, European Commission, negotiating with other countries around the world. How do you see your specific role inside the European Parliament in shaping EU trade policy?
Well, as I said, one of the pillars is what we're calling open strategic autonomy. And I know there's a big discussion around this and what the boundaries are and the borderline between protection and protectionism. But I like to remind people that autonomy is a Greek word. It actually comes from two Greek words, aftos, which means self, and nomos, which means law. So literally what it means is making the rules. making the rules that we live by. And this is the role of the parliament, is to make the rules and do so through the prism of democracy, because we are the elected, after all, democratic instrument. So therefore, I think that is our role. Our role is to safeguard the multilateral rules-based order in a way that will create a level playing field and bring benefits to our citizens while safeguarding our core values and democracy.
Okay, so the importance of shared values nevertheless trumps any sort of wild agreements out there, and I think the industry will no doubt be supportive of that, because it also is the guarantor of a European cultural identity, as we've heard before. So thank you very much, Anna Michelle, for having been with us. Thank you so much. And so now we go deeper into the spirit sector with the overview of the Trade Review 2021. I am joined by Pauline Bastidon. She is Director for Trade and Economic Affairs at Spirits Europe, and she will take us through then the latest findings and figures. Pauline, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jean-Paul. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this 2021 Trade Review. I think few in the industry would debate the fact that 2020 has been an incredibly challenging year, marked by COVID, marked by EU-US disputes and more, an ever-increasing number of trade barriers. But it's also been the year where I think we've definitely risen to the challenge and demonstrated that we have an incredible spirit of resilience. Hence the title for our brochure, and hence the title for today's event. And I really like the three key words that Anna Michelle was sharing with us. The future will be resilient, adaptable, and based on foresight. And we're really trying our best to demonstrate all these values and qualities in everything that we do. So 2020 has been indeed a challenging year. We've shown, however, that we could adapt ourselves. One big trend that we've seen this year has been the emergence of e-commerce and home delivery. Unfortunately, it's been limited by limiting factors such as regulations, for instance, in some countries that don't allow us to make the most of it. But we've seen that we could rise to the challenge nonetheless when we were given the means. If we look at our top 10 export markets in 2020, so of course COVID had already started to strike at that time, quite early in China, for instance. Our first market, you will notice, remains the US. And that hasn't changed in quite a number of years. By far, the US is still our biggest market, in spite of the trade disputes that have really hurt ourselves as well as our US counterparts. And because the industry is so interlinked across the Atlantic, this of course has had a negative impact. So our performance could have been better, but well, we still managed to maintain a good position with the US. The second market that you will see is a new entry. It's the UK, which of course is now a third country. We of course import a lot of spirits from the UK. We sometimes forget that we also export a lot of spirits to the UK. We couldn't see in the 2020 figures the full impact, of course, of Brexit, but we're a little bit concerned that we might see a bit of a decrease next year as a result of that. The third one is China, still a very stable market for us, very stable export market, relatively open. Although I have to stress that we still have potential for growth in that market, because imported spirits taken as a whole, not just EU spirits, but all imported spirits, don't even account for 1% of all consumption in spirits in China. So there is certainly potential for growth there. We see some challenges ahead, certainly for 2021 and 2022. In the person of regulatory threats that are coming our way, as well as a very challenging geopolitical environment, and increasing tensions with China. So the really important thing for us is to make sure that we retain a very balanced approach towards China, that we continue to cooperate whenever possible on a regulatory level, particularly, and that we try to keep a good balance between defending the European values, of course, and defending the economic interests as well. When you look at the other key markets in 2020, no big surprises for the next one. Russia has maintained its position as an important market, but here too, we face some regulatory hurdles along the way with the technical regulation on alcoholic beverages, and of course, a very, very difficult geopolitical environment with a negative spiral in the EU-Russia relationship. So let's hope that, again, we'll manage to preserve a good working relationship on regulatory matters and a balanced approach towards Russia as well. Singapore is a hub, actually, for Southeast Asia, so that's why it's always pretty much in our top 10. We've seen our exports to ASEAN and Southeast Asia decrease quite sharply, and that's largely due to COVID. Canada, still the sixth market, very important market. We've benefited greatly from CETA and really call on all member states who haven't ratified it to do so without delay. But there's still room for progress in terms of getting rid of discriminations, which are still affecting imported spirits in Canada. So that was our sort of top 10 export markets. But aside from these markets where we already have a very good presence, there are a number of very promising markets where we see huge potential, currently largely untapped. One of them, of course, is the Mercosur market. And there, I mean, our plea is, of course, for everyone to ratify the EU-Mercosur agreement as quickly as possible. We are very well aware of the criticisms, but we think that the agreement will actually provide a platform to help address some of the challenges that we've seen, such as deforestation. And most importantly, it's a huge market, and we would have a first mover advantage by moving there. And the most promising, interesting markets there, of course, are Brazil and Argentina for us, where we still face tariffs, regulatory barriers, and tax discrimination. So this is really a way of overcoming these barriers and making the most of this potential. Where we see also great potential is with India. This has been mentioned a bit at the beginning. We were extremely pleased to hear that negotiations with India would restart. That's a really, really positive move, finally. So let's hope that they will give us what we need in order to make the most of this absolutely huge market and this huge potential. At the moment, imported spirits in India only represent less than 1.5% of overall spirits consumption, so we can definitely do better. But of course, the biggest hurdle is an import tariff of 150%, which I guess in any other sector would seem like an impossible barrier to overcome. But just think of what we could accomplish if that were to be removed eventually. Then, of course, the ASEAN bloc, an extremely promising market as well for us. It's going to be the third most populous area by 2030. Huge import tariffs rates as well, 150% in Indonesia, 60% in Thailand, and a very challenging tax and regulatory environment. So we can definitely try and do better there as well by overcoming some of these challenges, and EU policy can definitely help us. Sub-Saharan Africa, admittedly smaller than the other markets that I was talking about a minute ago, but we see tremendous potential in Sub-Saharan Africa as well, particularly in countries like Nigeria and Kenya. South Africa, we already have a fairly good penetration in the market. There are significant challenges there, and we need to really make sure that the business climate is as positive as possible, that legitimate trade is favored over illicit trade, and to try and see if we can get more liberalization for tariffs for spirits. And last but not least, e-commerce that I mentioned at the beginning. And just to say that by 2024, so less than 5 years now, that market is set to double in size. I think it was fairly niche before the COVID crisis, but we've seen what we could do with it if given the means. So again, for us, it's important that this opportunity is unlocked. In return, we've been working very hard on developing responsible principles for e-commerce to be just as responsible as we are in an in-person setting, if not more, to try to really make sure that we combat the threat of underage drinking and any other risks that could stem from it, and make it a very safe channel and a very convenient channel for consumers as well. Something which, of course, is going to be central to trade policy going forward, and we are no exception to that, it's sustainability. We've really tried to be as sustainable as possible from farm to glass, so from the very beginning to the end of the process. And our ambition is to be carbon neutral by 2050. And we see trade as really an extension of that. We're trying to export our good practices everywhere where we have a presence, in all the markets where we have a presence. And you will see in our brochure published today numerous examples of how we're trying to reduce the use of plastic, reduce glass waste, increase recycling, and support access to water, amongst other examples. So this is key to us, as is, of course, our rural local roots. And I would just remind you that 2/3 of our exports are actually products covered by geographical indications. So the local element for us is absolutely essential. So how can we unlock the full potential of spirits exports? How can we make sure that we have a sustainable growth going forward? First of all, by continuing to resolve the ongoing EU-US trade disputes. Very good, positive progress on Airbus-Boeing, but indeed we still have the steel and aluminium dispute, as well as potential threats ahead. So we need to really make sure that there is no escalation and that we go back to tariff-free transatlantic trade in spirits. We need to ensure that sectors in which the EU has a trade surplus are not targeted or brought into unrelated disputes, and that also goes for their equivalent in other countries. We need to deepen the constructive dialogue with China, particularly on regulatory matters, in spite of the increasing tensions. To ensure an effective implementation of existing FTAs, not least CETA, that I mentioned earlier. To create a level playing field between the EU and local companies in third countries, and put an end, for instance, to fiscal discrimination. We also need to pursue a very ambitious trade agenda with ambitious trade negotiations, starting with these high potential markets that we were talking about, not least India, and ratify already concluded agreements without delay, such as the EU-Mercosur agreement. And yesterday, there was a clear plea from 12 business organizations, including ourselves and Business Europe, to ratify this agreement without delay. So this is really a plea to the Commission, the European Parliament, and member states. We have to protect, strengthen the rules and the relevance of the WTO. It's an essential piece in this global rules-based environment. It offers predictability to companies. It needs to be defended, and we'll continue to defend it. But we need it to be reformed, and we need it to still get the political support that it needs. Whenever possible, it's absolutely essential that we prioritize multilateral solutions to common issues and ensure that policies are WTO compliant. So that also goes for things like digital tax or the carbon border adjustment mechanism and implementation of the Green Deal and Farm to Fork. We need also to continue to promote and protect quality products, such as EU spirits, as well as geographical indications. As I said, 2/3 of our products are protected by geographical indications, and that's a key factor to boost our exports. And last but certainly not least, we need to tackle illicit trade by making sure, first of all, that we have a positive framework that favors legitimate trade, looking at taxation, for instance, as one important parameter, ensuring that there is a robust enforcement of IPR rules, secondly, and heavy penalties for those who engage in illicit trade. And third, but certainly not least, invest in education of border officials as well as the general public. And if we manage to do all of these things, we will hopefully manage to see our exports boosted, but also fiscal revenues for the EU and other countries boosted, and growth and jobs creation all over Europe, as well as a way to the sustainable growth that we're all calling for. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pauline, for a very complete and comprehensive overview of the situation. I like the parallel in a way that you make. On the one hand, and like the policymakers would be in charge of the ethical values behind trade, but you as a sector, you're also in charge of the own responsible consumption of your products wherever they are across the world. You were talking about the way e-commerce might affect that, and I was just wondering, would you say that in terms of exports, the biggest issue for your sector are these barriers to trade, or nevertheless consumer acceptance and consumer demand for these products is still something that you would need to work on as well?
I think consumer demand is there, definitely. We could probably invest in promoting some of our lesser known GIs or some of our products which are perhaps not so well known yet in all these markets. So there is possibly some progress to be made there, that's true. But removing barriers such as very high import tariffs, 150% in India, that's a really blocking factor. We've seen bans, unfortunately, pop up in many countries as a result of COVID, lately also in South Africa, to give you an example. So overcoming all these barriers is absolutely essential. And how can the EU do that? How can the Commission do that? Through continued efforts and work on market access, on their market access strategy, work with member states as well as industry, of course, because after all, we are the ones facing the barriers and with feet on the ground, but also by making sure that we work in great partnership with our allies across the world, where we face similar barriers. It's better to work together rather than alone. And it's also very important that there is a very good link to the EU delegations, and we make the most of that very useful network.
Okay, thank you very much, Pauline. And you will be staying with us because I rely on you also to keep an eye on the Slido to look at some of the questions raised by the audience, and hopefully you can also bring some of those into our debate, which will start now. So that acts as a reminder to the audience that's following. Please raise your questions in the Slido so we can also raise them with our speakers. So thanks, Pauline, and stay with us. So now I'm delighted to introduce our panelists. We'll be together for about an hour to discuss some of these big issues that have already been set by our previous sector, both in terms of international trade, but also on the spirit side. So I'm joined by Matthias Jørgensen, who is head of the US-Canada unit at DG Trade in the European Commission. Welcome, Matthias. We have Susan Danger. She is CEO at AmCham EU. Susan, welcome.
Good morning.
Good morning. We have Iana Dreyer, who is founder and editor at Borderlex. Good morning, Iana. And we have Darya Galperina. She is chairwoman of the International Trade Committee of Spirits Europe and head of international trade at Pernod Ricard. Good morning, Darya.
Good morning.
So let me first start with you, Matthias. and Michelle already mentioned the recent EU-US summit, which seems to be unlocking some problems of the past. Would you say that we have entered a new era in the transatlantic relationship? And what do you think we can expect to see after this summit in terms of the bilateral agenda? So remaining trade disputes with the US, but also in terms of common goals, no, with for instance, the reform of the WTO.
Thanks a lot, Jean-Paul, and really thanks a lot to Spirits Europe for inviting me. I'm really delighted to be here. Trade policy is made not only between the Commission, the Council, and the European Parliament here in Europe. I think civil society is a key element in that. And we're very happy that we can count on Spirits Europe to make its voice heard. to get into the debate, not just when it comes to spirits and your own particular sectoral interests or concerns, but also in the much broader debate. And I think that's really, really important. I think it's a great question you've asked me, Jean-Paul, and I'm delighted to be here on this panel to discuss it with you. I mean, I think it's clear, you know, that we come from having had a very bumpy relationship with the US under the past administration. I think we saw a deterioration in bilateral trade ties with lots of tariffs and decreases in exports, for example, when it came to stainless steel and aluminium from the EU to the US. I think we saw very complicated rhetoric with the EU being put in the same basket as China. And we saw also a real decrease in terms of trying to deal with common challenges. Now, a new administration came in. I think it was greeted as a chance from our side to have a reboot, to reset the transatlantic trade relationship. And I think we also saw a lot of very positive statements from the side of the US that they wanted to be back, that they wanted to rekindle the transatlantic alliance. Now, the question from people like you and other people is, that's all very nice with the rhetoric, okay, but what's really going to happen? And the proof of the pudding is in the eating. And I think we've just had maybe not the whole meal, but we've had already something quite nice on the table, which is the EU-US summit. I think for us, this was a very positive summit. There was, again, a reaffirmation of what we want to try to do, which is to increase, grow the bilateral trade relationship, deal with common challenges like the WTO and China, but we actually also delivered, and I think that's important. We've taken a big step forwards in terms of solving the aircraft dispute. It's not completely laid to bed, but I think this is a massive improvement in comparison to where we were just 6 or 7 months ago on this long-running dispute. So we've made a truce for 5 years. We said we're going to look at the issues, and we said we're going to look at it in a collaborative manner. We've also said let's try to not only look at let's try also to solve the steel and aluminium dispute. Now, it's not solved yet. I think you have a real interest from the side of Spirits Europe to look out and pressure us to solve it. But we have given ourselves 6 months to solve it. So 1st of December. And as you know, the EU really took a major step forwards there in terms of suspending unilaterally the rebalancing measures, which were supposed to come into force on the 1st of June. We did that because we felt that we had to really give it a chance. But I think also importantly, in the bilateral relationship, we're only just looking at, shall we say, 20th century issues. We also really try to look forward and see, okay, where are the jobs, where's the growth for the future? So we've launched the Trade and Technology Council. Very ambitious, 10 working groups in a whole lot of areas, and where I think we will really try to see how can we grow the bilateral trade and investment flows there. How do we keep them open? Because that's a big difference, I think, in this area between us and the US and our joint relationship, and then relationship we have with a number of other players in the world in this area, including China and Russia. And we've also sent a signal that we want to get serious in terms of joint challenges, the WTO and China on non-market economies. Now, are we in a new era of transatlantic cooperation? I think we made a really good start. I think if we achieve really putting the steel and aluminium dispute to rest by the end of this year, I think we've made a real step forward and delivering where it really counts, not just in the rhetoric. And we can focus on the bilateral agenda in the Trade and Technology Council, because I think it's really important for people like you to understand that when you have disputes, a lot of the airtime and a lot of the discussions at technical and political level is just taken up by managing the disputes. And that's very negative when you want to grow the relationship in other areas, including wines and spirits. I think another area where we really hope that we can move forward is WTO. We have a pledge from the US to go forward on that. Whether that's really an area where I can say that we have a new understanding, and where to a certain extent we will have a return to the old days, where EU-US collaboration was instrumental in driving forward the multilateral agenda. For example, in terms of launching the DDA, not only in finishing the Uruguay round, not only in getting the ITA through, not only in having some successful work in the WTA, but also really driving forward the agenda. I think that issue we still will need to see. The US, very broadly, in a very bipartisan manner, I think is doubting whether multilateral rules and the WTO is an efficient vehicle for setting the rules and having these rules being respected and implemented by what is their main concern for the moment in trade policy, which is China. Is the WTO going to be efficient in terms of dealing with the challenges that we have with China? We believe it. We believe that we're dealing with China and other non-market economies in areas of steel or aircraft or lots of areas. We have a toolbox, and that toolbox includes, of course, autonomous measures, and the US likes that. It also includes, but it also includes rules, and includes bilateral rules, and includes multilateral rules. And bilateral rules, you've seen, we did the CAI. Okay, it's a bit on ice for the moment. That's a reality because of some overreactions from some very strong reactions, should we say, from the Chinese side. But we believe that rules has a place there.
I think I understand from you that it's a positive starting point, certainly more positive than it was even just a few months ago. But it's still early days to have a strong policy alignment, let's say, between the two blocks at this stage. But there might be hope, if I understand. If I go then to Susan, a reaction also from you then on your views from this recent EU-US summit, and do you think there is a strong partnership and alignment between the two blocks moving forward?
Yes, no, absolutely. And thank you very much to Spirits Europe, to Ulrich and team for inviting me here today. Delighted to be here. Yeah, I'm just trying to think. I think we're all agreeing with each other on many aspects of here. But absolutely, to answer your question, very much we see now positive momentum, and we felt very optimistic about it. I think it's already been mentioned by a couple of speakers there, how this was the first overseas visit of President Biden. So made a big statement by coming to Europe. I think perhaps one important element to note here was not just President Biden who came. He came with a great contingent of other senior level officials. So there were a whole range of other meetings going on and dialogues going on. I mean, we were fortunate enough here actually to have US Secretary of Commerce Raimondo together with Commissioner Breton here for a conversation with business. And perhaps if I could just elaborate on that, in fact, I think the really perhaps an element we haven't touched on yet is the not only big business, but SMEs. We put together a forum here where we brought together European business, US business, business of all sizes as well. So I think that as well gives a very positive message about illustrating how intertwined we are. So this for us is extremely important, I think. The message of showing how much both the economies are intertwined, how important the transatlantic economy is, but how it's not just about big business, it's about business of all sizes. So yes, with regard to your question, indeed, one thing that, the expectations that we had coming out of it were indeed that we've had this phrase so often now, low-hanging fruit. I don't think anything's really low-hanging, if we're honest, but that some of the irritants would be put aside. And indeed, Jean-Paul, we did see some of them put aside. At least the Airbus-Boeing dispute we're on the way to resolving it. We've got a 5-year plan now, but very much that was very, very much a first step and was received positively. Also, because of the knock-on effect it has on other industries. Steel and aluminium were not there yet. That was one of our other expectations. And of course, privacy shield that was also referred to earlier, data flows. However, I think what we have seen and very positive is, what's been put in place now. Indeed, the Trade and Technology Council and the 10 areas of cooperation. Obviously, we have to see some action on that. We've seen a number of other groups put in place. We've seen a high-level group on climate put in place. We've also seen a working group put in place for steel and aluminium. We've got a commitment now for reform of WTO. So maybe I'll just leave it there, Jean-Paul, to say very much the word now is about action, but certainly a positive momentum, although a reality check is we're not going back to how it was before. I think the important word for me would be we've got to build up trust again. It's not a given that we just forget about what happened over the last 4 years. We're not resuming anything. We need to work on building up that trust again and move forward on these very important groups that have been put in place.
Yeah, and you already touched upon the existing trust and also a trust that you're working on between businesses on either side of the Atlantic. But what would you then make of the political elements of that? On the one hand, the EU trade strategy and the US trade strategy. What is your assessment of these policies, and do you see any political commonalities there that you could work on?
Yeah, indeed. Actually, they're very similar in a way. There are quite a lot of commonalities. I mean, with regard to the EU trade strategy, which came out at the end of last year, we're very positive with regard to that. Also, I mean, a couple of aspects on that it has stressed the need to remain open. I mean, it's true to say, as the business organization here representing US business, which is absolutely committed to invested in Europe, sort of prime investment destination. This is not just about trade, this is about investment as well, which drives trade. Absolutely imperative that the EU's trade strategy remains open, and the US strategy. I think one element we did see in the EU strategy was the reference to open strategic autonomy, which Anna Michelle nicely elaborated on for us, and indeed gave us the Greek definition, which is a very interesting one. I think it's true to say we absolutely, as US business, understand Europe moving to strategic autonomy, but we would impress a little bit of word of caution there to make sure that whatever that means, everyone seems to have a slightly different definition of that, but that it doesn't translate into protectionism. That is just not good for anyone. We've seen that. Again, I go back to how intertwined our economies are. We cannot afford to move back into a protectionist environment. But coming to the commonalities between the two trade strategies, I think also one element that has not yet been mentioned is the focus on the US side of the emphasis on workers. Absolutely key. Catherine Tai, the USTR, has come out on that. I know she did while she was over here in Europe just 10 days ago. And again, I refer back to Secretary Raimondo and her absolute imperative need to meet with SMEs and talk about everybody in this. And I think this is a really important point to remember. We need to focus again on the narrative. I think both sides are actually committed to that. What is the benefit of trade? What is the narrative for the citizen? What is the narrative for the smaller companies? Because the divide, we've seen it grow over the last period during COVID. We've seen the divide growing. We've seen it, sort of inequality growing. If we're careful, we don't want this to implode. So very much, I think, going back to your question on the commonalities, the US have said it's a trade strategy for workers. I think on the EU side, it's very much, maybe it's the open strategic autonomy. Indeed, that has to be sold also to citizens here as well. I think we need to also make sure that the US realizes we have the same challenge here as well on the European side. Remember TTIP, we have to also convince citizens that trade is good for them too. So those are a couple of things. But overall, Jean-Paul, I think it's really positive moving forward, and I'd refer back to now the Trade and Tech Council and these 10 areas, those in themselves, those 10 areas are indeed fantastic forward-looking areas for both sides to cooperate on.
Yeah, to some extent, I would say that, you know, once open strategic autonomy becomes an acronym, that's when it will have been a long-term policy in the European Union. Until we refer to it as open strategic autonomy, it's definitely still new. So, okay, that's good. That's good overview from your side. If I go then to Iana, what do you then make of the recent EU-US summit results? Do you share the assessment of your fellow panelists so far?
Thank you very much, Jean-Paul, and thank you very much, Spirits Europe, for having me here today. I mean, yes, I would share the assessment generally that it's a positive step to have this summit right at the beginning of the Biden administration, and that, you know, the symbolism around that. I would also stress in particular the Trade and Technology Council, how important a step that is, because this is the future of our economy. And as even has been said, you know, earlier, that even affects, you know, old-fashioned, if I may, spirit sectors where, you know, e-commerce and all these things come in. So I think that is extremely important. But I will speak a little bit if I were sort of a risk management department and be a bit the devil's advocate here. First of all, nothing is resolved, not even the Airbus Boeing. Everything can go back. You know, we just need a bit of political change in the US and we can revert to old to type, and that could happen even as soon as next year. Catherine Tai, just after the announcement of the deal, speaking to US reporters, said, you know, if something goes wrong, we can still go, even before those 5 years ends, you know, reapply tariff pressure. So I don't think this is over. So a lot of political capital needs to be invested into resolving this. It's crucially important. Also, what I saw missing is no positive agenda on old-fashioned market access issues. No more talk of tariff elimination. No more talk of conformity assessment. All these kind of things that at some point that needs to be brought back to the table. We understand the circumstances, but you know, this is a little bit interesting to observe. I think if we can say that we're not going back to old days. I mean, even the good old days before Trump were never easy. I think it's just going to stay even more challenging and will require a lot of political capital investing in this bilateral relationship. And I think that has already been said before, but one cannot stress this enough, is we don't know what will be the relationship of the US with the WTO going forward. There has been strictly no movement on the fundamental issue of dispute settlement and reform of the appellate body. Even as late as on Monday, the US statement in the dispute settlement body was, we don't want to talk about it yet. So we will talk about it, but when the time comes. I don't have the exact quote, but that's how it is. I listened yesterday to US TR Catherine Tai. She comes from the angle, we're going to do a worker-centric trade policy, which is fine. So, but she's been putting forward the new proposal in fish stocks on slave labor. So this is adding new complications, but dealing with putting their agenda forward, which is fine. But that could also sideline some other structural issues. So I think this is something that really needs working, because where we're moving at, even if it's the nice Democrats, so to speak, who are in power, we're still moving towards power-based trade relations going forward. And that is fundamentally a systemic issue. It's really a real challenge for the EU more generally. So I would say continue investing in the alternatives, such as the MPIA, the alternative appellate body system that was established. Don't drop it. It could still be useful in the coming years until this issue with the US is resolved, if it is ever resolved. And we know from the United States that it has always difficulties with international whatever courts. So I mean, that would, in a way, the dropping of the appellate body would probably not, it's not in their interest because they've won so many cases in future, but in the past. But it would also be a form of reversal to type for the United States, and that's something I think as an EU would certainly start, be prepared for, have it a really plan B. This also means that the other trade agenda in terms of fostering rules-based trade, such as continuing with the FTAs, Mercosur, rethink, all these initiatives that have been taking India, all this stuff needs to be really pushed forward to diversify trade, to have rules and dispute settlement procedures with all these countries going forward if the WTO cannot deliver. It does not mean not investing in the WTO. I think this is a moment, but we need to think of alternatives because everything feels a bit unstable despite everything. I'll leave it there.
Thank you for bringing in some words of caution. I mean, indeed, we're sort of walking on eggs here, and yes. We heard some optimistic speeches. I think it's good to hear the more cautious ones. And you mentioned the power-based element of trade, but also the winners and losers of globalization. So one needs to balance all of that. And maybe then that brings me to Darya for a comment, because on the one hand we heard the optimistic messages. We hear also now some of the more cautious messages on trade. Where does the old-fashioned spirit sector, as was mentioned, stand in this, and especially such a heavily export reliant sector?
Yeah, thank you very much, Jean-Paul, and I'm glad to be on this panel. And all speeches before me, they are very complimentary. Optimism and caution go hand in hand. So we are not debating this. When I'm thinking about the Spirits Europe engagement with the Commission, it always revolves around three words: we applaud, we support, and we demand. So when we look at the recent EU-US summit and the fact that the EU and the US managed to find this 5 years truce on the aircraft disputes, this is obviously, we applaud the Commission for this, because it's not completely resolved, but still it's 5 years, and it means that during this period we will be able to focus on what we do the best, to serve our consumers, to continue our CSR activities, create economic growth in Europe and in the US. And Matthias previously mentioned how much time disputes take. So with this all time, we can now focus more on tackling protectionist practices in other parts of the world. So this is all good. To say maybe on the US, yet, we have the steel and aluminum dispute. It was already mentioned a couple of times, but I just want to stress here that we really must address as a priority damaging practices and damaging policies of the past. Because when we speak about the US and our industry, we're not speaking about us and them. It is one industry. So counterbalancing tariffs that we have on US spirits, it is about European companies who cannot get returns from their investments in the US. And it is about American companies who cannot, who are severely damaged in Europe, their jobs that they create, operations and investments. So all this is very much interlinked. So that's why we continue urging the Commission to take it as a priority. There is a positive agenda, but please dedicate your time to resolving this issue before the end of the year, so we can really leave it for good. So this is about the US, but the trade for us is more than the US. It's really, we're a global industry and each market matters for our success. So it's not one or another. To grow, we need complementary opportunities. We need complementary markets. We cannot pick and choose. So EU trade policy has developed a number of good outcomes for us, for which we are very grateful. EU-Vietnam FTA, it's a last year, but we started benefiting very much out of this FTA. EU-Mercosur negotiations have been concluded. That's again another positive development for us. The strong emphasis on enforcement, and we've been asking for strengthening the enforcement for years. So finally we have it, and we're really looking forward to continue engaging with the Commission on enforcement strategy and the WTO reform. I cannot stress enough the importance of the WTO for our sector. It is absolutely critical. When a couple of years ago we saw a couple of countries breaking from the WTO rules and norms, we saw how much this unpredictability brought to our business. And imagine if all countries were doing the same, all members of the WTO, it's a mess. That's absolutely the nightmare that we can only hope will never happen. So that's why we do engage in the WTO reform. What we want to actually have is to move away from the discussions about what needs to be done in the WTO and stop doing it. I think the priorities are known. Business have submitted a number of priorities. Governments are saying the same. So we're speaking the same language here. We know what needs to be done. And Iana, you rightly pointed out the appellate body. Our sector has a number of success stories in the WTO dispute settlement. So we know what we're talking about when we speak about the strengths of the WTO dispute settlement. So let's really engage between ourselves, and we can also leverage our network and continue engaging with member states and increase political engagement with member states around the WTO reform. So all these good examples that I brought, Vietnam, Mercosur enforcement, which they're very helpful to us, because what we do, we talk to our constituencies in member states to speak about the benefits of the international trade, of open trade, of strengths of multilateral trading systems. So we need these examples to feed our narrative, and we have them, and so we obviously we obviously use them in our interactions. Maybe to also add another element on cautious side, the business environment becomes really much more complex, and the challenges that we face are much more complex these days. We still have this classical WTO compliance trade irritants in many countries of the world, but what we see more and more that there is a kind of a trend for issues, surge in issues that don't easily fit under the WTO framework. These issues are mushrooming. Pauline in the beginning already mentioned the issue of illicit trade, and that has become really critical, particularly at the time of COVID. What is illicit trade? It's smuggling, it's counterfeit, it's unregulated production. And this is our key competitor in many developing countries. It's not distinguished competitors, but it's really illicit traders. So we need to find a way to start talking about this and need to start tackling these issues. Otherwise, we will not be able to deliver the economic growth in developing countries, not be able to create jobs that we need. Maybe to finish on kind of a global thing is indeed, all these geostrategic rivalries between the Western world and some countries which were mentioned already before, China and Russia. We do worry. We do worry what possible further steps, be it from Western countries or from these countries, other countries, can bring us. So this is the reason why we do advocate for a very balanced and constructive dialogue with our trading partners. We ask to avoid escalations when possible and to address concerns through multilateral channels instead of bilateral. So I stop here for the time being.
Thank you. Yeah. We don't want to go too long. Otherwise, the list of cautiousness will become maybe too long. And I think already it would be good to hear a reaction from Matthias, because we hear the desire to bring pressure a little bit down to allow for sectors to grow again. And how do you see that then moving forward, especially in relation to the WTO reform, the partnership with the US, and especially then in relation to some of the other major players in the world, especially maybe China? A comment also on China moving forward, Matthias. If you unmute, yeah.
No, absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I think you are really right. I'm very very happy to hear these things. Iana has put some of the points that I was making, but a bit more bluntly. I think for the EU, WTO is really important. We need to protect it. The patient is on the operation table. We think it's urgent to proceed to surgery and to work. Other part of some members of the rest of the medical team are not so much in a hurry. We're just a bit afraid that the patient might die on the table. I mean, for us, we think it's essential to have a successful 12th ministerial in November. And if we want that, we have to get cracking now, because these multilateral processes take a long time. However, we are seeing that, for example, the fishery subsidies discussion has just gotten a bit more complicated by adding new issues. I think when it comes to reform, the digital settlement mechanism, we don't just want to go back to the past. I think we're really ready to have a conversation with the US and with others about what's working and what's not, because this is not theoretical policy making. This is about what works for all the members who are part of it. So if there are members who have concerns, like the US, and I think we recognize that some of the concerns are legitimate, we have to look at it and how we have to solve it. But what we do need to avoid is that the WTO's function, and somebody's doing some work, so I'm sorry, here in the office. If we look at the WTO function, it has a negotiation function which is absolutely crucial. It's not working. It has a transparency function which is also complicated, and it has an enforcement function in terms of the dispute settlement mechanism, which is really under stress. Now, we believe that is a very important issue. We want to work with the US on it, but it's still early days, I think, with the US. We believe there's urgency. The US is still looking at its position, but we're really looking forward to try to engage with the US on these issues, because again, that's just the point I repeated before. We believe that in order to tackle the big challenges that state-led economies like China and others pose, we also need the rules aspect, international rules. We also need to improve our to have more arrows in our quiver of autonomous measures, and you've seen we're doing that, with the IPI, with investment screening, etc. So I think I think there's a lot of common ground with the US there. The enforcement issue, we know enforcement is very important for the US. We've seen that in what Catherine Tai is also super enforcement. It's also super important in our trade policy. The assertiveness, the worker-centered focus of the US is, I don't want to say that we discovered it before, but you all know that 7 years ago we made a communication on trade policy which was called Trade for All, because we understand that it has to function for everybody. And it has to address also, trade policy has to address in tackling the big challenges of our time, and so one of them is climate change. Now, how to do that, I think we have to see. But I think we are impatient and patient at the same time. I think we're impatient for working together with the US, but we also understand that they're in a position where they have just come in. I think they moved fairly rapidly on a number of issues, and we hope that we will go forward in all these areas. But there's some good signs. Look at the discussions on tax, international tax. I mean, around the beginning of this year, we were close to having the US imposing unilateral tariffs for the EU digital services taxes. Now, the new US administration comes in, it engages in the OECD process. We've been able to defer that a little bit. The danger is not gone, but there's a perspective of a solution there. And China, I think China is important because you talk a lot about the pivot to Asia in the US, etc. And the EU needs to be frustrated for that. But the reality is that the US is not the only country, not the only part of the world that has done a pivot to Asia. The whole world is doing a pivot to Asia. Africa is doing a pivot to Asia. I dealt with Latin America for a number of times. You look around the Latin American map, the top trader for all Latin American countries virtually, except for Mexico and a couple of the Central Americans, is China. And the EU, well, the EU's biggest trade and investment partner, if you take services and goods, is the US, without a doubt. But when it just comes to goods, China has just dethroned the US. Okay, so everybody's pivoting to China or to Asia, and it is an important trading partner, and we need to see how to deal with it. We cannot just pretend that is not there. So we have to engage with China, and it's not. I mean, it's not easy. It's slowed down a little bit with all the noise around the KAI. I think, but you know, EU trade policy is long term. The KAI is there. It's gonna come back, just like EU Mercosur. It's gonna come back. It's there. It's something that is good. We all know it's good. We've got to find the right political conditions. It's got to be the right political constellation to do it, because it responds to some very important basic principles of EU trade policy, which is that it's better to have rules than not to have it. It's better to engage than not to engage. And it's better to use these channels that we have to address issues like trade and labor, or like trade and labor in relation to KAI, or trade and labor or trade and environment in relation to Mercosur. I'm talking too much here, but I think it's very important, and I think I want to come back to the issue on China. I think there's enormous commonality of concerns and interests in relation to China from the side of the EU and the US. We both want to have an equal access. The reality is today, China has more access to our market than we have to theirs, and that doesn't correspond to economic realities. China uses a number of trade instruments in a manner which is not acceptable. We need to deal with that. And on some issues like steel and aluminium, I mean, we have an overcapacity problem, which has caused by China, and which has had some very negative impacts on EU-US trade. I mean, we think it's completely unacceptable that the US has qualified EU steel exports as a danger to national security. But the fact that there is a problem with the steel industry in the US is to a very large extent due to the enormous overcapacity which is in China. So we have to deal with these issues. I think we want to work together on it. I think when you got something, you always want more, as Darya said. You know, we want more from the US. We think there's more, but I think we made a really good start.
Yeah, it's a sort of a rebalancing act that is required here. If I understand you well, both in terms of understanding the way that trade is going in the world, but also between EU, US, and other trade partners. If I go then to Susan, what would you be looking out for in terms of, you know, the sources of tensions that are possible between the EU and the US, and especially maybe in relation to that partnership versus other trading partners around the world? What would be those key sources of tensions that you would be looking out for? And maybe also a view for the spirits sector, because there's also a question on that in the audience. What would be the specific challenges that the spirits sector should be looking out for an open and strong transatlantic alliance?
Okay, thanks, Jean-Paul. Yeah, okay, the areas of tension, maybe I can just take an opportunity before we do that to mention one thing that has not come up, which is just overall economic recovery. I mean, I remain optimistic. I think I recognize all the words of caution, but I think I still remain optimistic. But we have to remember that where there's this sort of slight negative feeling about speed and timing, remember we're only still 120 days, or maybe it's 140 days into this administration. Actually, quite a lot has been achieved. I think a huge amount has been achieved. As President Biden said, the proof's going to be in the pudding. But let's go back to the first point, which definitely both sides agreed upon during the EU summit, which is we all need to support the economic recovery. If we don't support that, we're going nowhere. I don't think we've brought that up so much today yet, which is the green and digital transition. And there are a huge amount of positive announcements that were made, and actually cooperation that's been going on already between the EU and the US on clean technology, many areas of cooperation in the area of green. So I just want to bring up that point, first of all, that we both sides need to support the economic recovery before I get to the areas of tension, and welcome that response. One area of possible tension within that, but supporting the economic recovery actually, is lifting travel restrictions. So there's a small one for you, which we called out, which we haven't mentioned here. That also impacts trade. Whether it's citizens, whether it's students, but also business people are just not able to travel at the moment. So we do need to lift travel restrictions between the EU and the US. So that's the first point, is on economic recovery. Second point, yeah, reducing the barriers to trade, which we've called out for. Indeed, in some areas of tension. Actually, I just want to impress the point. Totally agree. US business totally agrees on reform of the WTO. Absolutely, we need it. If we didn't have the WTO, we'd have to invent it again. So we need to reform it. So it's an absolute no-brainer there. But there are some other areas there we could establish some more mutual recognition agreements on pharma, for example. Now, and then thirdly, on emerging issues, which also are some of these sort of barriers and tensions, I think we've got some good roadmaps in place now that were outlined in the EU-US summit, whether it's the working group on the 232 tariffs, absolutely. That is an area for tension. So we do need to resolve that. The vaccines task force has been in place. High-level climate action groups been put in place. Green Tech Alliance has been in place. Loads of groups put in place. Areas of tension, indeed, I would agree. Well, we've got to move forward on WTO reform. Tax is a potential area of tension. However, again, the positive is that the US has come forward and said, yes, global minimum tax. We need to look forward on this. We do need to move forward in an international environment on this. We do need to use the OECD. Areas of tension are how of the digital tax. Does Europe continue? Some countries have moved forward with a unilateral approach. That's not going to be helpful. That will be an area of tension. So we do need to be indeed cautious about that. Another area of potential tension is CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. I believe both sides agree that we do need to do something to address, competitiveness and trade of certain industries, producing of carbon leakage, producing in areas which have lower standards with regard to carbon emissions, and then importing back in. That is not going to help. So I think both sides agree that we need to have a mechanism. We would support that. An area of tension is what that mechanism is. So I would like to think, though, just as it's, on the whole, absolutely areas of tension exist. But I do believe that the signs from the US summit and what we're seeing at the moment are positive. We need to rebuild trust on both sides. So that's about dialogue, putting in place the right forum to start moving on this. And I was also called for speed. Perhaps finally, just to say, I totally agree with spirits, but I haven't answered the question on spirits. I'll leave that to the spirits experts here. But absolutely, we applaud as well. We applaud what the EU is doing and what the US is doing. Let's give some encouragement here. We've had 4 years of turbulence, so let's just, be encouraging here. We do applaud. We do support. US business is always there to help. We've been doing huge amounts on climate and sustainability already. I'll give you loads of examples of that. And yes, there are demands, but I do think we need to help as well. Business needs to stand up and speak out, both European business and US business, because we get told that also in Europe. US business speaks out, European business needs to speak out as well. So a lot to do, but I would still end on a positive note.
Indeed, a lot to do, a lot of tension and a lot of tension potential. So if I then go to Iana, who was our first cautious panelist, you're also observing trade policy. I'd be interesting to hear from you on how open. I think that was already mentioned that European trade policy is open. There is openness, but then when you hear about all these tensions, that usually makes you want to retract and curl over and go into a corner. So how open do you think EU trade policy really will be in the future?
I want to focus away from this open-closed discussion because I don't think it's actually really relevant, nor what we are seeing, nor what we are going to see. I mean, I was trained as a political economist in trade, so we have one term that is called or mercantilism. We have a trade policy that is, and that's not specific to the EU. That's inherent in the fact that governments act in a certain way, differently from business, which is, try to push export and limit imports. And I have the feeling that where we're shifting in practice is even more a form of stronger bilateralism, mercantilism, where we push more for exports or a bit more defensive. There's one aspect of that. It's not specific to the EU, but that's how it is. The second thing is I have the impression that trade policy, and that's actually pretty clear in the trade policy review, is becoming more transactional in a way, more conditional. We're going to, raw materials, we're going to actively do partnerships with other people than China. Sort of this more narrowly in a way, but more specifically interest-based sourcing across the world, etc. So I think that open-closed is not the right way of looking at it. We can applaud, we can criticize. It's also partly the result of how power relations have developed in the global environment. So you have to be more proactive and transactional and things like that. So that's how I would see it. There is one issue, and that is something that worries me, as always. It's a big question for all the outsiders, the non-EU member states. Is this a new regulatory drive of the EU on climate and the environment in particular, but also on digital? It's a fact that regulation, even if it doesn't intend to close, it is a barrier. If you have one type of regulations in one place and another regulation in another place, well, it creates an automatic barrier. So that is an issue. That is a big question mark over EU trade policy going forward. How much unilaterally will it want to sort of put forward its model on regulation without potentially taking into account the needs, the legitimate needs and requirements of trading partners. That's why I see the TTC, the Trade and Technology Council, is critical. It's absolutely critical that the two sides talk and agree on core principles of regulation based on these same values. As we know, we all want open societies, democratic principles, human-centric artificial intelligence, and both will not regulate the same way, but according to same principles. It's absolutely critical that this works. And then that also will, by definition, also define how most of the rest of the world will have to work. So that's where I see it. Climate, I mean, Susan has already mentioned the carbon border adjustment mechanism. That is a potential area of tension. Indeed. So again, if it's possible not to hurry up, but to wait a little bit, that's my personal recommendation. I know that some industries are in a hurry because CO2 prices are rising. And that leads me to a final point as well, is the neighborhood. I think we have a big problem in our neighborhood, and we don't want to really face it as EU. That brings us to this regulatory overbearingness in a way, or system that we have, where we are no longer seen as attractive anymore by the Swiss, by the Brits, by the Turks, and we have had big problems. The Swiss have walked away from a negotiation just recently. It's a big trading partner. I'm sure it's also a big trading partner for the spirits sector. Britain will need to find other ways of thinking about it, thinking long term of how we deal with this issue of expanding our regulation in a way and still being open to collaboration and trade here. It's a question mark, big question mark for the future. Thank you.
Yeah, and maybe this transactional aspect that you raise might also lead to more power-based relations as well. So that's an interesting one moving forwards. If I then go to the spirit sector, Darya, what would there be your key recommendations, expectations from policymakers in terms of strategy, actions, reassuring your sector? What would you like to leave them with?
Thanks, Jean-Paul. So the Commission, the EU, has an ambition to have Europe which is greener and sustainable. It's digital and connected. A stronger Europe in the world with with economy that works for people. And spiritsEUROPE and Pernod Ricard, as a member of spiritsEUROPE, we absolutely embrace it. So our business depends on the vitality of agricultural components. We do our environmental roadmaps to support the preservation of natural resources. We work to minimize waste through all our supply chains. We work with our industry is a kind of consumer-centric industry. So we work on ensuring the balance in rights and promote diversity. We do promote responsible drinking. So vision-wise, we're aligned. But all this requires investments and innovations. And for this, we need to trade. Simple as that. For this, we need to start opening new markets and preserve what we already have. Without this very basic, old-fashioned thing as a trade, we cannot build and contribute to the ambition of Europe. So with this in mind, I would probably have 3 areas where I kind of think where we need trade policy to go and what we need from the trade policy. Of course, it's an ambitious trade policy. So we need to open new markets and we need to have a strong enforcement, and that should remain the key objective of the trade policy. What we want also to do, we want to come to the Commission with the problems that we have in the markets and to start talking about them, and not to come only with the problems that the Commission has tools to deal with and political appetite to deal with. So what we want to have more, we have to have a dialogue about trade-related domestic reforms in third countries. Of course, the Commission is strengthening their enforcement toolbox, anti-coercion being the one, and we applaud it. It's very important to have these tools in hand. But at the same time, these are very drastic measures. So we hope that it will never come to this, that these measures would have to be applied, and that the relations would be kind of based on sanctions and threat of sanctions. Cooperation, this is what is kind of our objective. What we also need, we need more transparency in trade policy. Digitrade has done tremendous work when it came to make their trade policy more transparent. Now what we see more and more that the trade policy becomes linked to other policies and to foreign policy. And here, once again, becomes less transparent. So we need to have much more closer collaboration between the private sector and the Commission to understand better what next steps in policy can bring us, because it's not only the final outcome, final measures that would impact the business, it's also the uncertainty of the direction of the trade policy that would have very concrete implications on business decisions. To bring it back to the EU-US relationship, we've talked a lot about this cooperation between and common agenda between the EU and the US on China. And it was also discussed very much in summit. But we want to understand better what exactly this cooperation would mean, in what concrete measures it will result, and what kind of opportunity and threats we have to weigh in our business risk assessment. So this is extremely important for us. And obviously, the final is that what we need the trade policies that delivers in our lifetime. Yes, trade is a powerful tool, but that's definitely not the only tool to bring the positive change in the world. Speed should not come on the expense of the quality, but the right balance needs to be struck. And as I explained previously, companies are not operating in vacuum. we are bringing the change, and we're not waiting for instructions from the government to transform ourselves to be fit for the future. We're doing ourselves because we want to be relevant in the future. So by opening up more opportunities for and venues for trade, the Commission will give us opportunities also to export these best practices to third countries and to start transformation in markets from within. And what Anna Michel in the beginning said, she said that trade is a positive force for prosperity. And we truly believe into this. And with this, I will stop.
Okay, thank you very much, Darya. I think we have another 5 minutes. I would just like to also bring in Pauline, who's been looking at the questions from the audience. Pauline, could you maybe pick one question from the audience that we can raise here to our panelists?
Okay, there were lots of questions about indeed where the new transatlantic relationship leaves us with regard to these new big blocs like China, Russia, Indo-Pacific region. A few questions on the relationship with China as well, and the need to reconcile a principled approach with the importance of the Chinese market and economic interdependencies. But okay, the question that perhaps summarizes all of that and will allow all of you to answer as freely as possible is, I think, among the last one that we got. What do you think that the EU trade policy is going to look like 5 years from now? And I would add, what would be your wishes also for the future trade policy 5 years from now?
Okay, yeah, that sounds like a wrap-up question as well. So what I will do is I will give you each 1 minute to reflect on that. So what will EU trade policy look like 5 minutes from now? I think it would be fair to kick that one off with Matthias. So please, Matthias, you have 1 minute.
Well-functioning WTO, which is engaged in a negotiation process to update its rules for covering also issues like e-commerce, trade and labor, etc. Ratification of all the big trading agreements that we have negotiated, and hopefully concluded negotiations with other partners like Indonesia, China, etc. Southeast Asia is really the big, shall we say, white spot still in EU trade policy. And with the US, an understanding of how to become really partners, to be partners in an uncertain world where we have concerns in terms of supply chains, in terms of safe trade, but where we can trust each other. So we don't necessarily need to reshore, but we can do some friendshoring between the EU and the US.
Thank you very much, Matthias, on time, and thanks a lot for all the preparation and the great insights that you gave in today's panel. I will now move to, I think, Iana, actually. I'll go to Iana for a 1 minute wrap up.
That's a big challenge. I would focus on digital, maybe. 5 years, maybe conclusion of an e-commerce plurilateral agreement in the WTO. That would be fantastic. Some concrete outcomes on the TTC, not on everything, but definitely on digital, and a conversation on the competition platform aspect of it. I think these would be the most important things. And back to more facts-based discussions in the public realm on trade. Wish list.
Wow, fantastic. You did that in 30 seconds, you know, summarizing the EU trade policy in 5 years' time in 30 seconds. Not bad. Thank you very much, Iana, for sharing also your insights on this panel. It was great to have you. And now I will ask Susan for her perspective in a minute.
In a minute, yes, I think I can agree with my two co-panelists who already spoke. I would say, you know, firstly, no irritants there, no tariffs, all gone. Airbus, Boeing, so in 5 years that would be solved. So looking really good on that front. Absolutely, too, I would say WTO, fully functioning reforms, working well, dispute mechanism, working there. As I said, we all need it. I think thirdly, I would say, we need a sort of functioning forum of dialogue. Currently, there is no formal well, now we've got the Trade and Tech Council, great, but there are formal structures between Canada and the US and many other countries, but there isn't anything between the EU and the US. So we need a functioning forum where we can really talk. Fourthly, I would say, regardless of the US administration or whoever's in the EU administration, so let's be neutral here, regardless of who is leading, that we remain talking, working together, striving towards common goals, and that and then that sort of brings me to my last bit, which is that in 5 years, we're trusted allies, friends and allies sharing the same values still.
Thank you very much, Susan. That was just a little over 1 minute, but to finish on trust, I think is good. I hear a lot of speed as well to get there in 5 years, so hopefully that will materialize. And so thank you very much for having been with us, Susan. And I now hand over to Darya for her 1 minute predictions.
Thank you, Jean-Paul. As a representative of the industry, which is export-driven and seeing the future, also outside the EU, we want the trade policy to be balanced. So we want the trade policy to continue delivering on opening up new markets, to have a strong enforcement and defend our rights around the world. We want the trade policy to promote our success story and promote our traditions around the world. And we want the EU trade policy to defend us from unpredictable steps and unpredictable political realities in third countries. So it's a long agenda. It's a long list. It's definitely many things to be done. But I think the trade policy will remain relevant today, tomorrow, and in 5 years for our sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Darya, and I'm sure that you will be still relying very much on trade in 5 years' time. So that was my timer blaring. Thank you very much for having been with us also and sharing the insights from the spirit side. Darya, I think that was a very insightful panel. So thanks to all of you for your great preparations. And I will now ask the audience, having heard all these great insights, how confident are you now for the future of European spirits exports? You can answer in the poll in the Slido. And I will now hand back to Ulrich to hear a little bit about your key takeaways from this discussion. I mean, we touched upon so many topics. It's not even just trade. I mean, there are so many other areas that affect trade. So what are your key takeaways from today's event?
Thank you. You're asking a very difficult task to summarize a hugely inspiring and really a debate that covered on all the major issues we need to talk about at the moment in the past 1.5 hours. It's been hugely interesting to follow this. So thank you very much. I think, we all see a lot has happened. I remember waking up on the 31st of December of this Annus Horribilis 2020 to the fresh announcements of new tariffs from the previous administration. That's just less than 6 months away. And as was mentioned, the new administration is just 140 days in the job, and it's day and night. We see a lot of positive things happening here. So we've come a long way, and there's reason for optimism. I think you all heard it as well. I think we all agree as well here that trade is a positive force for prosperity. I think that came through from everyone in the panel and in the discussion. And it's very important that this is not just an abstract sentence, but that this is made real, that this works for workers, as they say in the US at the moment, or that citizens can relate to that. Here, I would claim that spirits are uniquely suited to make to show that trade works. It's a very tangible product. People can relate to it. And I think that the figures that Pauline presented on our export success, are also very tangible in terms of the success and the delivery of our export to European jobs and growth. At the same time, I think it became very clear we can't take any of this for granted. And that's what the last year has shown. And as Iana warned, it can go back. So, while we're optimistic, it's thin ice. We need to work on this. And we heard as well that there are some geopolitical challenges that could derail this positive developments at the moment, as well as this what was called the new regulatory agenda, CBAM, digital. So we need to navigate very carefully in the months ahead to make sure that the positive momentum in trade policy is maintained. And most of all, I think everyone hinted at the fact, what's key is that trade policy must be a joint effort. It's a joint effort here in Brussels, but it's also a joint effort in terms of the transatlantic relationship. But even more, it's a joint effort on the global multilateral level with regards to a functioning and powerful WTO. And I think today has been a great joint effort in terms of our debate this morning, and it's something I really hope and encourage everybody to continue in the weeks and months ahead. I mean, this is up to us as well. I think to everyone who's been here and listening in, debating, asking questions. So we need to be the master of our own destiny in a certain sense as well, and take this positive momentum of this morning to move forward. And then one final remark. I think somebody dared to mention that we would be considered an old-fashioned industry. I would strongly dispute that and make a precise statement that old-fashioned is actually a very nice cocktail, for those of you who know. And it's actually a cocktail made with bourbon whiskey. So what we think is very, very old-fashioned is that European consumers at this moment in time still have to pay a 25% surcharge when they enjoy an old-fashioned in the EU. And here's my promise to you: the moment that in Europe consumers can again enjoy old-fashioned cocktails tariff-free, we'll be fast to organize, hopefully, a real event with all of you and offer you a very nice tariff-free old-fashioned cocktail at the end.
I think there's something nice in old-fashioned anyway, vintage and all the rest of it. So I think that's good to remind people, though, that it's an up-and-coming sector as well. And let's see how up-and-coming it is in the results and their confidence of the audience in terms of the future of European spirits exports. I think the average score is on 4.3, so that's largely confident, between 4 and 5. Ulrich, if you were to answer this poll as Director General of Spirits Europe, how confident would you be for the future of European spirits exports? Would you align with this score?
Absolutely. I think largely confident and a bit more confident after this morning and the past weeks. So we need to build the confidence level up, as I said. But yeah, I think it's a good reflection. And on this positive note, I think it also falls upon me to really thank all of you for this morning, for a wonderful discussion, for a wonderful event. Would like to very much thank all the panelists for their contributions, for being here, for staying in, for all their interesting remarks. Special thanks also to the whole team, particularly to Pauline and to Carol, for putting all the effort in for this event. For all of you who listened in and asked questions, and also a special thanks to Jean-Paul for leading us through this debate and moderating this. And we hope to clearly come back together in a similar way on this issue still this year. I think it's something we need to. The debate is there, lots of issues on the table. We need to keep working on this. It's a joint effort, and I think we as Spirits Europe clearly want to and continue to play a very proactive part in the trade debate here in town.
Thank you very much, and a good day or a good night or a good morning to all of you who have joined, and the recording will be made available as well. So thank you a lot for having joined. Thanks to all the speakers for their preparation. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.